Good morning, everyone. Just to welcome you all. I know we have people from many different parts of the world, and we welcome you back to what is the 16th webinar from the CEADIR series. CEADIR being the Climate Economics Analysis for Development, Investment, and Resilience. And it took me a little effort, but I'm glad I think I got that right. So today we're really pleased to have a group that departs a bit from past topics. Just as a reminder, these are archived and accessible later, so if you do hear something and want to hear it again or share it with others, you'll be able to do that. In the past, we've had many topics that relate to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and to climate finance. But in this session, we're really going to make an effort to turn more toward engaging the private sector. And we know that's important in terms of total investment, the I in CEADIR, but it also turns out to be an extremely propitious time to talk about this subject. This very week, there are a couple of events in different parts of the world that support the significance of this topic. So currently in New York, there is a meeting of the Task Force on Climate Risk Disclosure, also sometimes being referred to as the Bloomberg Task Force, for its chairman, former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, very significant financial figure. And they are to report by January on how to come up with more common metrics to discuss climate risk. Simultaneously, this week in Bonn, Germany, at the home of the UN Framework on Climate Change, hundreds of officials, mostly from developing countries, are at an expo on national adaptation plans, or NAPs, as we call them in climate world. And part of that discussion as well relates to, in the developing countries, how to engage more with the private sector in preparing for climate change and in developing national adaptation plans. So we're very fortunate in having an extremely expert group to talk about this, and I'm going to now turn it over to our moderator from AID, Matt Austin.
Thanks, Alan. Welcome to everyone here in the room and everyone online as well. I've listened to a number of these online. Good to actually be in the room and on the other side getting to participate. My name is Matt Austin. I'm with the Office of Private Capital and Microenterprise at USAID. Our office is focused on mobilizing private sector investment into key sectors to development, including infrastructure. According to the OECD and the World Bank, the estimated annual global infrastructure investment need is about 3.7 trillion, of which there's 2.7 trillion currently financed. Filling this $1 trillion infrastructure finance gap is critical to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and really the lack of adequate infrastructure impacts nearly every part of USAID's development portfolio, including health, food security, economic growth, energy, education, and humanitarian assistance, to name some. But though this financing gap for infrastructure is a difficult challenge. They're very complex. There's long time horizons to deal with, and it subjects these projects to a large number of and wide variety of risks. Over time, the investors, developers, financiers, and insurance companies have developed methods for managing a lot of those risks. But climate change is becoming an increasingly prevalent and important risk that is being and needs to be taken into account. As we all know, climate change is accelerating, and for long-lived assets like like infrastructure, the potential impact of climate change is great. There's more frequent catastrophic climate events, rising sea levels, and increased variability of weather. All of these pose significant risks to infrastructure projects. And it's critical that climate change risks are assessed and addressed as a project's developed, designed, and financed. So we're lucky today to have a panel here that can, a diverse panel of experts that can that will allow us to dig into the topic of the impact of climate change on the financial risks of infrastructure projects, and, like, from a number of different angles and perspectives. And we have Roseanne Casey, the policy lead for Power Africa, who focuses on enabling environmental issues, governance, and kind of the development of the power sector in Africa more broadly. And she'll speak to Power Africa and how climate change is part of the Power Africa thinking. Vladimir Stenek from the International Finance Corporation, he's a senior climate change specialist there and leads IFC's climate risk and adaptation programs and initiatives, and will be providing the financier's perspective on climate change risks and how they're assessed and integrated into the project development cycle, and particularly how they impact the financial components of project development. And finally, we have Matthias Jungen from Swiss Re. He's a senior vice president at Swiss Re, responsible for the engineering lines here in the Americas, mainly consisting of insurance and reinsurance of large construction projects. And he'll talk a little bit about Swiss Re's thinking, the insurance industry's thinking about climate change risk and different approaches that they're developing to manage those risks for projects. So we're going to start with Roseanne. As we know, Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world when it comes to climate change, and as Power Africa and others are looking to accelerate the development of the power sector in the region, climate change is an important consideration in how the projects are developed, selected, and financed, and how the sector as a whole is developed across the region. So I'll turn it over to Roseanne to talk about Power Africa.
Thank you. For those of you in DC, we know you're here just for the air conditioning, but we appreciate your presence in the room, because I think doing a webinar is like, there's always this mystery of who's listening, so it's nice to have some faces. So as Matt said, I work on Power Africa. I've been with Power Africa for almost 3 years, and I'm the policy lead, which has kind of been this nebulous, what exactly does that mean? But in effect, what I focus on is kind of the how and the sustainability side of what we're doing on power sector growth. So it's clear that Sub-Saharan Africa needs power and that it's very impactful, but power in and of itself doesn't actually solve problems. So we have to think about how it fits into the bigger picture, which solidly includes climate change. So it's really a nice opportunity to be here. One of my approaches to speaking publicly is always trying to add a little bit of expectation management. And I think Power Africa was launched with a lot of press releases and exciting announcements. And I want to try to make sure that I help people understand really what Power Africa is trying to pursue and how it fits into broader context. So, the opening slide is really just setting the stage and giving some context that Power Africa is responding to one of the greatest needs for power access and availability across the subcontinent. We're focused on Sub-Saharan Africa, which is, everything, a huge variety of countries, most of which have approximately a 30% access rate. So you've got 60% of the population on average that doesn't have access to refrigeration, to some basic power that will provide for social needs. So the impact this has on economic growth, the impact this has on social service, the impact it has on medical education, all of those basic things, is enormous. And so what we're doing in power isn't really for the sake of power, it's for the sake of economic growth and the development of these economies, which has, huge ripple effects. Power Africa is also a presidential initiative, and for those of you who aren't quite sure what that means, which would have been me prior to working on Power Africa, it means that this is an effort to tie together all of the U.S. government investments in power. And so there's officially 12 U.S. government agencies that are part of Power Africa, but unofficially any U.S. government agency that's doing power-related work in sub-Saharan Africa is kind of in that circle. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we're creating as much synergy between what we're doing on different fronts instead of all working kind of in our own lane and doing our own thing. And so USAID, what we typically bring to the table is a lot of technical assistance and a lot of support in working with governments, working with institutions, and helping with this development aspect of it. The agencies that are involved in Power Africa include OPIC, EXIM, State Department, Treasury, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce. So all of the U.S. government agencies bring a different level of impact, bring a different level of resources. And so, again, this kind of comes down to what's our area of influence and how are we using that to best advantage. So to take this back to climate, the high-level goals are really around megawatts, around access, but also really around how do we change the nature of how we go about this, from being donor assistance of us funding construction of whatever that infrastructure might be, to us really partnering solidly with host governments, with other governments, with the private sector in particular, to think about how do we change this from being a donor-driven, very kind of binary investment need to something that is really solidly integrating the private sector and looking at not only where's the risk, but where's the opportunity. And especially as you look at the climate side of the energy equation, there is so much changing. It's not just a fossil fuel-based, you build power lines and there you go. It's really a different game right now. And so Power Africa's approach and our high-level goals really are, again, we're trying to add 30,000 megawatts to the grid, 60 million new connections, which is an enormous and a very ambitious goal. But we're also trying to do this in a way that incorporates a better balance between fossil fuels and renewables, and also a level of sustainability. If you look into 10, 20 years into the future, you look at the availability of different fuel sources. You look at the natural resource balance within countries, within regions, among different countries. What our job is to really work with host governments to say, what is your best opportunity for power sector development? What's your needs? What's your opportunity? And how do you consider, in terms of the natural resources you have available to you and in terms of the regional resources, whatever they may be, which may be even buying power from your neighboring country, when you look at all of those resources, what's your best opportunity? And in particular, in many cases, it's helping to change a mindset from let's build a power plant or let's just build a very standard power facility to let's look at the mix of renewables and on-grid and off-grid and potentially regional resources that are actually going to answer our needs over time. And so sometimes it's kind of dissuading going for the easy fix of how do we just add power to how do we add power that's sustainable and that encompasses broader goals. So I know this slide's a little bit dark and a little bit busy, and I'm only putting it up here kind of as context, but it's looking at the tools and resources, the partnership, and it's a very acute outline of the continent of Africa, but it really is, it tells the story very well of we're looking at a number of different resources, both in terms of financial and in terms of natural resources. One of the things that I I want to bring up, because it's constantly a question for us, is, I'm going to go back to this slide, is what resources we're promoting. On the climate question particularly, there's those who have voiced their concern about whether Power Africa supports different fuel sources. Officially, our approach is that we are all of the above. We are not ruling out any specific fuel sources. Having said that, what is in our kind of opening statement, in our talking points all the time, is we're trying to increase megawatts and access by increasing the balance of renewables in countries' power systems, and also by looking at cleaner fuel sources. So I opened a huge can of worms about a year ago trying to innocently look up the definition of clean within U.S. government vernacular, and it led to a 42-page document. But yeah, never do that again. But all that to say that, again, back to my point of U.S. government, we've got 12 official agencies and countless unofficial agencies involved. We all work towards and according to different guidance, different policies, different specifics of how we work. OPIC, for instance, has I think it's a carbon cap on how much they finance every year. And so they have a different way of counting what the climate impact is of what they're investing in. Different agencies have different ways of going about it. Overall, Power Africa's intention is to look at how to move from potentially more carbon-heavy fuel sources to cleaner options, or the best possible option given that country's resources, given that country's situation. So we're never going to have a rule that says there's no gas or there's no X or Y. There's a low likelihood that we'll that we will be involved in certain things, but we technically have an all of the above approach. The other part about our approach is very, very much partnership based. So it's a government-to-government collaboration. We're not entering these markets to say, let's figure out how we can just pay for power solutions. We're here to say, how can we look at what your best options are? How can we work with you as governments to plan? Planning is a huge part of looking at the climate impact of energy. What's the full circle of it, including the utilities, including the governance, including regional solutions. So private sector, again, these guys are going to talk a lot about risk. Everything we do is trying to facilitate the ability of private sector to participate in the market. And then this expertise. So we're looking at risk, but we're also really looking at opportunity. And right now, the opportunities in renewable energy and especially in the off-grid space in sub-Saharan Africa are huge. I'm just going to quickly go through these last slides, which you can look at in more detail later, and I'll take specific questions. But our strategic pillars around generation, we're prioritizing renewable. We're focusing on lower emissions, looking at best possible outcomes with the natural resources of these countries. In connections, we went through this process this year where we developed the Power Africa roadmap. We're in our third year, and we got to this place where we wanted to make sure that we had a solid roadmap guiding us. And so as we looked at the access goals, it made it very clear that the beyond the grid and the grid-based achievements really mattered, and it really focused on what we have to do off-grid, all-grid, or what we're calling beyond the grid, which includes a lot. And really just recognizing that there's opportunities that are going to evolve over the years, but that the off-grid space is huge, and it's going to have a lot of opportunity for our access achievements. Our technologies, I think I've pretty much talked about this, but there's been an overdependence on few resources. There's also inability to predict sometimes the markets of fuel sources, and so looking at renewables makes sense for so many reasons, financial as well as just availability. And then looking at how you do these to scale. So there's a lot of great ideas out there. There's a lot of great examples of solar and of wind, et cetera, but we're looking really at how do we bring these to scale, and how do we make the most of the entrepreneurs and the private sector side of this, and helping those possibilities become reality through our influence. So I've talked about the combination of grid and off-grid and how we're seeking to find a balance in what we can incentivize in that space. And I think I also talked enough about really just this enabling environment. So helping governments to understand, number one, what are they incentivizing or making impossible in terms of the development of their power sectors, policy governance, there's a lot of complicated issues in there, and then enabling slow change. And you know, we'd all love to see quite fast change, but I think really we have to look at this in terms of good examples, in terms of regional examples, and helping look at success and helping our partner governments understand where the opportunities are for them. So lastly, I'll just quickly say, I think in the first couple of years we were focused so much on the private sector and on megawatts that we didn't have as much engagement with civil society, but it's critical in terms of understanding impact, understanding opportunity, and understanding local concerns and how some of these climate goals, some of these climate opportunities are being integrated into power, that we are both informally and formally really increasing our dialogue with civil society to make sure that the conversations are there, that we are helping our private sector partners, project developers, government partners, others, because a lot of the projects that we're involved with aren't really our projects. They are negotiations between governments and project developers. But we have potentially an influence to help make sure that that dialogue is happening, which includes discussion about INDCs, climate goals, emissions targets, all of those things, and making sure that we are helping facilitate the best possible outcomes and understanding everyone's investments and everyone's concerns as they look at the power sector growth opportunities. So I'll leave it there. Tons of content, and I'm happy to take specific questions.
All right, thanks, Roseanne. I think moving from the regional and sector focus that Roseanne presented, I want to take it down to the project level and turn to Vladimir to talk about how IFC's looking at the impact of climate change as they look to support the development and financing of projects.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for the invitation from the CEADIR. So some of you may have heard about International Finance Corporation. We are the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, and we deal by and large with the private sector, investing in projects around the world. We invest basically in all sectors in practically every developing country in the world. And an interesting thing that many don't know is that we invest by and large, again, on commercial terms. So financial success is one of the key, financial sustainability is one of the key parameters of our work. The other two being environmental and social sustainability. And of course, with such a large portfolio that's spread everywhere around the world and with climate change looming over us, a few years ago, we asked ourselves, well, what climate impacts can do to these investments? And with that, we started a climate risk and adaptation program, and I'll showcase a couple of infrastructure projects that we did as part of that program. But before that, just a short parenthesis. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Annapolis, and Annapolis is a city close to Washington. It's based on the Chesapeake Bay. And Chesapeake Bay is one of the largest estuaries in the world. It's several hundred kilometers long, very shallow estuary, and with relatively low lying land. As you can imagine, sea level rise is one of the problems. So I was in Annapolis, and we were listening to a person from local environmental NGO speaking, and I asked whether she has noticed changes in real estate prices due to sea level rise. Now, one would imagine that there would be changes because, right, home purchases aside, they may choose their homes and pay for them based on personal preferences and pay more. But when it comes to investors, the decisions are very rational. So basically, everything goes. The question is, how much return will I get on this investment? So I was looking at waterfront properties, and these properties are rented about $3,000 in nice places. An investor in this case would say, well, if a property brings back $3,000 a month, that's basically $36,000 a year. So that's the income. On the cost side, there may be $1,000 for insurance, maybe $2,000 for maintenance of the property, $1,000 in taxes, so overall $32,000 income. So investor says, all right, I will be getting $32,000 every year, and if I calculate this into perpetuity, then the overall valuation of the house discounted at 3%, and 3% being kind of a relatively safe risk-adjusted return, comes to about $1 million. So one would say, well, if I can rent it at $3,000, I'm willing to pay $1 million for this house. So far, so good. There are many waterfront properties on the Chesapeake Bay. However, when we start looking at climate change, things get a bit problematic. So this second photo shows the nuisance flooding. So whenever there's king tide, there's flooding involved with that, and it starts flooding parts of Annapolis and waterfront properties. And then there are also storm surges that come from hurricanes. So these are extreme events that are hard to predict, but certainly one needs to take them into account. So this is the same monument in 2003 after a hurricane passed by. So what happens with valuation there? Is that $1 million realistic for such a home? Well, nuisance flooding in the Chesapeake Bay area is becoming much more frequent. So NOAA put out this information that the increase in the past 4 or 5 decades in the days of nuisance flooding has been 925%. So that's really an important increase. And then the question is, well, if this trend goes on, can I rent this house for $3,000? And then the assumptions start changing. The investor may say, well, I may, in best case scenario, rent it out for $2,000. Then also the insurance is probably going to go up, and Matthias probably will be able to say later from the insurance perspective whether that's a plausible assumption. And then the cost for maintaining the house. So instead of $36,000, I'm going to be getting $24,000. Costs are going up. I do the same valuation, and the price of the house all of a sudden is maybe $500,000. And that's obviously a huge difference, $500,000 and $1 million. The investor then may say, well, how do I adapt to that? I may build a seawall, $200,000. Therefore, the complete value of this house is $700,000. But still, there's a big difference. So from the investment perspective, this is one of the examples, and this is just private decision or small investors. One can see that it really matters, climate change, and it matters to take it into account. Now, to go back to the story, this person I asked about the real estate prices, she smiled and she said, well, funny that you asked, because last year my husband and I decided to sell our property, which was a waterfront property, precisely because of these reasons. She said, we think that in about 5 or 6 years, the market is going to take notice of this. Right now, nothing is happening, no changes in prices. But market is going to take notice, and the prices are going down, so we left this. So when it comes to larger hydropower projects, the approach is similar. It's much more complex, but it's similar. So this is a hydropower project in Zambia, Kafue Gorge Lower. A few years ago, the government of Zambia asked World Bank Group, both World Bank and IFC, to structure a PPP, public-private partnership for a hydropower project that's about, if I can see, 750 megawatt. So the PPP structuring involves the analysis of the hydrology of the dam and so on, so all the technical documents. And as a part of it, they ask us to do a climate risk analysis. Basically, the question is whether there's going to be enough water for the hydropower project and what other implications may be given climate impacts. This area it's a rather complex. The Kafue Flats, which is basically a national park, hydrologically very interesting but very complex. area because it's very shallow, so huge amount of transpiration, water flowing down very slowly. There are a couple of other dams. There's urban water consumption for Lusaka, the capital, that comes from above the dam. There are agricultural companies with huge extensions of area there. So everything of this needed to be taken into account. So what we did was to build this complex model, and I won't go into details of everything that's on the chart, but basically the upper part is about the assumption and initial data. So we gathered a number of models, climate models from IPC, well, that we use also in IPCC. We did some downscaling and then took the essential variables that include precipitation, temperature, and so on. And using this information, then we fed the hydrology model with this information to see what changes there may be. From there, it went on to the reservoir and financial model, and it came out with results, right? Given our assumptions about the future, and basically these are these scenarios, how are there going to be changes in energy production and on the financial side? On the right-hand side, this box shows some of the other analysis we did for the extreme events like drought, extreme drought, or extreme flood, and also impacts on the environmental and social issues. So we put everything together, and from there should come adaptation options. So some of the interesting findings, this is one of them, is basically showing the changes in demand and supply. So basically the three little bars of blue, white, and green on the left-hand side of each of these three time periods in the century show the difference in the supply, in the demand given climate change. So first bar is what are the current levels. The bar is what are the projections just given the growth business as usual. And the green one is growth plus climate change. So obviously there's much more need for water because for urban water use, for agriculture, evapotranspiration, and so on. The other two bars are the supplies for two scenarios, and basically they show how the precipitation and the flows are going to be changing given climate impacts. And what one can see is that, well, there's a lot of uncertainty, that's for sure. The uncertainty bars are quite high. But in extreme years, even in early century, the demand may outstrip the supply. So there may be much more demand for water than the water availability. And certainly that's the case, becomes much more probable as we go future in the century. Again, another analysis looking at generation and after-tax returns for different scenarios. So the original scenario, it was concluded that there will be more than 2.5 gigawatt hours produced. But as we analyzed other scenarios with climate change, and then depending on the scenario, we are seeing that the production and rate of return is going to be much lower than projected. Finally, we did a stochastic Monte Carlo analysis of the return. So internal rate of return is what we did was do a round of rather limited number of scenarios to see what would be the average return. So based on this, we saw that the average return, or the model, is going to be around 18 or 19%, and the required rate of return back then, and it was in local currency, was about 20%. So very important parameter. The projections with climate change showed that the project may not achieve its financial success because of the impacts. And finally, one of the conclusions that I think is relevant after what we've seen last year and still ongoing drought in Zambia that has affected, or Southern Africa, that has affected significantly the water resources. is that we foresaw that drought is probably one of the most important dangers and can lead to multi-million-dollar or million-dollar losses in investments. So this project, unfortunately, at some point, the government decided to pause it. So we never got really to the discussion and implementation of the adaptation options. But nevertheless, I think that what we've seen in this analysis are really illustrative of the need and importance of doing incorporating climate change into analysis of hydrology for hydropower projects. You can see on the map, it is a relatively small, but still has some significance because it moves about 1% of Colombia's international trade. It's located on an island, and it's connected to the mainland by a causeway. Later, I'll talk more about it. The port moves a variety of cargo, so it's a mix between bulk, grain, coke, and container cargo. So it's relatively well spread. The volumes are more, well, there's variability between the years, but overall the volume is steady and going up for the port. So this port, it was at the time an IFC client, and they asked us to do an analysis. Well, what can climate change do to their performance? So what we did in this work, and I won't go into every part of it, was to look at port not as one self-contained project, but rather just like a link in a big chain, big transport chain. So we didn't look only inside of the port's fences, but also what is happening outside. So, for example, what may be the impacts of climate change on shipping? What are the impacts of climate change on global economy, and therefore on shipping, and therefore on companies' profits? And also internally, what may be the impact of climate change on local economy and the demand for the goods that are transported on the transport routes and so on. But since the company has the operational and financial control over their assets, I'll focus more on that. So among the number of analyses that we did was, of course, the wind analysis, important because given higher wind conditions in the future, the cranes may need to start lashing, then business interruption can occur, and of course losses for the company can happen. We looked at the changes in the precipitation, both the average and the extremes, and it's on the steady rise. There are more extreme events, and this is very important for sewage and drainage. Basically, if drainage is not appropriately with appropriate dimensions, there is flooding, and the ports needs to stop operating. We looked at also health and safety and environmental issues. One of the health issues that we analyzed was we tried to correlate the diseases with climate or weather-related events, and then project it into the future to see what impacts it may be there may be for the company. So there was some good correlation with some eye diseases and skin diseases. Heart stroke was present, but not so much. In any case, this served to the company to pay more attention or focus more on the first couple of diseases that are there and put on preventive measures. However, where we did perhaps most work and we got the results was looking at the transport, internal transport, and the vehicle movement. So what we looked at was storm surge heights, so the nuisance flooding, storm surge heights, and maximum storm surge heights due to high winds. And basically, due to sea level rise and changes in variability, it's on the increase. So when there's this nuisance flooding, the causeway between the land and the port gets flooded, and the business interruption starts. So, of course, that starts bringing financial impacts to the company. So we modeled that. We took some, I think, conservative assumptions, saying, well, if water on that causeway is over 30 centimeters, if it's below 2 hours, we will assume no cost. But if it's more than 2 hours, then we'll start calculating a certain cost to it. So we incorporated that into the financial model. We discounted the company rate that was 16% at the time. Came up with the analysis of impacts. In this graph, you can see the analysis of impacts on company's overall business with and without the effects of climate change and sea level rise, and for different scenarios. So with all that, we presented the work to the company, and there were no strings attached. There was no obligation for the company to act on that. But a few months later on, the company, and it was unknown to us that they were going to do it, they announced a $10 million investment in the recommendations of this work, and a further $10 million investment in another port that they were operating. And on these two photographs, you can see what has been done between the first time that we went there and the bottom photograph is from this year. So basically, the causeway that was connecting the land to the port has been straightened, raised, and there were some other smaller interventions on the island, on the port. So just in concluding, I think that what one can say from both of these cases, first is climate change matters to the financial and environmental and social sustainability of a project, and one would better be advised to incorporate that. The other one is, and this is from this project, is that relatively small amount of effort and money can leverage private sector finance. So we produced this study for, I can't remember exactly for how much it cost, but it leveraged $10 million of private sector finance. The company went to a commercial bank and invested here. And with those $10 million, they protected several $100 million of infrastructure that it's relatively important for the city and for the country. Another learning from this is about data, climate data information. A lot of effort was spent on modeling, on finding information, on gathering it, on really deciding what matters and not. So I think that as if we had this kind of information that's done in appropriate way for appropriate geographies, time frames, and sectors, there would be much bigger uptake of private sector, also public sector, in incorporating climate change impacts in their analysis. So as a follow-up of this work at IFC, what we are doing right now is producing sector-specific climate risk management tools. And part of those tools is going to be a set of, data sets that address precisely this question, that provide information for very specific locations at global level for different and most material timeframes, and for climate indices that are material for each of these projects. That once we finish them, we hope to put them out and make them publicly available. So maybe in one of the next sessions next year, I'll be able to talk to you about those tools. Thank you.
Thanks, Vladimir. That's very interesting stuff. So when a big weather event hits and there's significant property damage, the first people the property owners call are the insurance companies, and so the insurance companies have done, and reinsurance companies have done a lot of thinking in terms of the potential impacts of climate change, and have become very sophisticated in modeling those climate change risks. And so look forward to hearing from Matthias on how Swiss Re is approaching climate change risk and some of the products that they're rolling out to address some of the financial risks to investors.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everybody. So I'm working for the Swiss reinsurance company, which is the world's second largest reinsurance company. we sometimes argue we are the largest, depending on what kind of metrics you look at, but basically we're one of two giants in the reinsurance world. So perhaps some of you in the audience may not be exactly clear about what a reinsurance company actually does. So what the reinsurance industry is here for is to pay claims from big catastrophes. So this is not the fender bender accident hopefully you won't have with your car. It's not about the tree that falls on somebody's house. It's really the big stuff when things go really bad. So for example, Hurricane Katrina, which led to an economic loss of more than 100 billion US dollars. Things like the Tianjin explosion. So really the big events. And clearly things like climate change have the potential of resulting in very big losses in the future. So it's of a key importance for us to understand what the risk of climate change is for us. Every year, give or take, just so you have roughly an impression, our company pays out roughly 20 billion US dollars in claims, and often more than several billions on one single event. I see that I'm starting with a very dark slide here, so let me move on right away. If you think of the catastrophes that can happen, we basically distinguish between two types of catastrophes, the man-made catastrophes and the natural catastrophes. So for man-made catastrophes, you would think of things like the Costa Concordia drama. You may remember this cruise ship that got stuck on a rock of the coast of Italy because the captain wanted to wave at somebody, and I think that generated a loss of 1 billion US dollars by itself. So that's a man-made disaster. And then the natural catastrophes are actually the even bigger portion of our business, and therefore understanding and modeling the effect of natural catastrophes is absolutely core to our business. So we invest a lot of time and money towards developing tools that can model natural catastrophes. And in view of climate change, we make sure that these tools are very nimble, that we can adjust them with any new findings coming from scientific studies, for example. And one thing we do on a very regular basis is to reflect the increasing temperatures of the water temperature in the Atlantic, because, as you know, when the water is warmer, you have a higher hurricane risk, and that can have dramatic consequences. We also work with organizations that span beyond Swiss Re to understand or to get a better estimate as to what the results from climate risk could be in the future. And one of them is called the Work Group for the Economics of Climate Adaptation in New York. And so you have a rough understanding of the numbers we're talking about. On an annual basis, on average, you expect to have a loss of 1.7 billion US dollars in New York City due to a hurricane. So that's not going to happen every year. We had Hurricane Irene in 2010, then we had Hurricane Sandy in 2011, and Hurricane Sandy led to a loss of 19 billion. So it's not going to happen every year, but on average, you expect something like that every 10 years currently. If you look at 2050, and those were the conclusions from this work group, we expect an annual expected loss not just from 1.7 billion, but 4.4 billion for New York City alone. So it's almost triple the value we have now. And there are basically two key drivers that lead to that increase. One is the fact that sea levels are rising, and they're expected to continue to rise. And the other one is just the increased frequency in severe storms due to climate change. So climate change is really very much at the center of our preoccupations for the future. What can we do to make our societies more resilient towards climate change? I mean, certainly we can probably stop pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We can do things, as Vladimir mentioned, which is loss prevention, make sure that our infrastructure, for example, is more resilient. What the insurance industry does is really, it can pay for the economic losses from those events, right? Because these losses are always going to happen. And You may think that the insurance industry is assuming the big bulk of those losses currently, and that's not exactly true. Just as one example, which is particularly present to my mind, in Latin America, roughly 80%, or more than 80% in fact, of all natural catastrophes are not currently being insured. So that's quite a dramatic number. In terms of our own behaviors, our own company, we want to lead by example. We have our own standards, and one of them was established back in the early 2000s, and since 2003 we've become greenhouse neutral, and we're continuing to invest in cleaner energy, to take Rosanne's point. And one thing we are doing currently is, for example, for our headquarters in Armonk, just a little north of New York, we are building a 2.3 gigawatt solar power plant that is going to be used to generate power for the entire facility for our headquarters, for our offices in New York City as well, and even some excess power that we're going to be able to provide to others. So we're very proud about that. In terms of natural catastrophes and the resulting losses, some losses are very present to everybody's minds. If you think of tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, and droughts, and the primary kind of loss that you will think of is the material damage loss. So if properties are being destroyed, they need to be rebuilt. But there are other types of losses, perhaps a little less visible. One of them is business interruption. If you have, for example, a shopping mall that was flooded, it can't sell goods for a period of time after it was flooded and until it was fixed. So you have a loss of business income during that time. But both of these, material damage and loss of business income or business interruption, are normally fairly well covered by the traditional insurance products. And so there's a challenge with insurance penetration in general, but the products are here. Some other risks are a little less known and less addressed by the insurance industry. And I'm just going to talk a little more about a couple of them, because that's where the insurance industry recently, and Swiss Re in particular, has developed products to assess those risks. So picture, for example, a solar farm with no wind. Sorry, what am I saying? A wind farm with no wind. Solar farm with no wind is very good, actually. Your solar panels are going to do really well. So picture a wind farm with no wind. It's obviously not generating any power, and that means a loss of income. So that's a variation in weather pattern that doesn't look as dramatic in the news as a hurricane, perhaps, or a tornado, but still has a lot of negative impact. Same thing, now I can come back to my beloved solar farm without sun, right? You won't be able to generate any power. Or the last example I'm going to quickly talk about is a hydroelectric station, so a dam, where power is produced by letting water through turbines, but it's not raining, and you basically have no water in your lake, and you can't produce any power. Right? So those are other types of risks. Perhaps they seem less dramatic in terms of headline news. And by the way, every time there's a headline news anywhere, we expect to have to pay a part of that loss. Right? If you see anything in Fukushima or anything of that type, we are going to pay a part of that loss. That's our business. Right? But these things are perhaps a little less present, but if you are an energy company, they're actually very relevant as well. So let me just dive a little deeper into some of those products. So both examples I'm going to talk about here are real examples, but although we as a company love sharing data, sometimes the perception that we handle everything confidentially because we want to keep data. No, we love sharing it. The only thing is it's client data, and we need to respect their confidentiality. So I can't share all the specifics, but you'll get a fairly good impression of what we're talking about here. So if you see this beautiful wind farm here, but those blades don't appear to be turning much, so that day is a very nice and sunny day, but not producing a lot of power. So an example we're talking about, this is actually an example in the United States. Think of about 95 wind turbines, so that's a fairly big wind farm, and that here has a capacity of 170 megawatts. For a retail price of 8 cents per kilowatt hour, that's, if you think of the US currently, the average price is about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. That means an annual output, an expected annual output of about 56 million US dollars. So that's fairly significant. Now, this output could easily be 5 million more or 5 million less, depending on how the wind is blowing on a given year, during a given year. You may think, and that's really what I was thinking at first when I heard about these products, you may think that over a year, the number of windy days and the number of days without wind, that it kind of averages out. But it doesn't. There are actually significant variations. And here is a picture of the variations, the historical variations of wind speed in that particular location where we are structuring this product. The output is here measured by the gray bars. Right? So the blue line gives you the average, and the particular insurance product does not need to pay out if the wind blows more than average. Then you manage to produce more power than expected, which is good news. The problem is all those years where it's actually less than average, and that's where the insurance product is paying out. So you see, for example, a particular visible one is 1986, so that's a little while back, but where the wind was blowing way less than average. But you also see fairly recent years such as 2002 or 2006 or even 2014, where that insurance product would have paid out to make up of that difference of the lack of wind compared to an average expected output in energy. I'll move on to another example, which is a hydroelectric station without water. This is not made up. There were severe droughts in Brazil last year. You may have seen that in the news, and also in Colombia, where several lakes were actually at 40% of their normal level. So if the lake is at 40% of its normal level, you're not going to generate a lot of power. The situation with a hydroelectric station is a little more complicated than a wind farm or a solar farm. Basically, if the wind farm, if the wind blows, then your turbines, your blades are going to turn, and the turbines are going to produce energy. It's fairly one-to-one. It's a direct consequence. If the sun shines, then your solar panel is going to produce energy. With rain, it's a little more complicated because the rain can fall somehow in a nearby valley, and the water may not make its way into that particular lake. The water may be absorbed by the soils. It may be blocked by dams that are upstream from the lake we're looking at. So it's a little more tricky. Still, it's something that can be modeled. And one way of doing that is just taking several weather stations, in this example 3, and taking for example, the average rainfall for the full year over those 3 weather stations. If you feel that one weather station is more important than the others, you can give that one a little more weight. But so the picture here, I'm really talking about an example we are insuring in Colombia. The picture here, however, comes from Switzerland because we can't disclose which lake we're working on here in Colombia. So this is a beautiful lake in my home country. In this particular example, the trigger is set as 75 millimeters of rainfall per year, which means that this is about 2.5 feet if you're not using the metric system. So if you have more than 750 millimeters of rainfall, you can generate the power you were expecting. If you, or even more, if you have less, then the product pays out. In this particular case, it's 720, which is 30 millimeters less than expected, and the payout would be $100,000 per millimeter. That means that in this particular example, for that year where there was less rainfall than expected, the payout would be $3 million. This is not exactly accurate historical data. It was, but it's very close to reality. For that particular project, you see that had the product been in place over the past 6 years, 4 years, the rainfall, which is in the second column, would have been above the trigger point, and there would have been above water to generate energy. But in 2 years, 2013 and 2015, in this particular example, the water levels would have been too low, and there would have been a loss of 5 million and 11 million US dollars respectively. That would have been absorbed by this insurance product. So these are very concrete examples of products we're developing, in view of gaps we perceive in the insurance industry, and that are going to become more relevant in the view of climate change. But if we take a step back and we think again about the situation we currently have of 80% of natural catastrophes that are now covered in Latin America, 90% of natural catastrophes that are not covered in emerging markets in Asia, I think there's really a huge opportunity for the insurance industry and the governments to work together and fill that gap. That's it from my end.
Great, thanks, Matthias. Very interesting. Well, I have a number of questions, but I think I'm going to hold off on mine and turn it over to the audience. Just a quick update on our online audience. So we have 69 participants online listening in, and thank you all for your participation. These attendees are from St. Lucia, Jamaica, UK, Cape Verde, India, El Salvador, Canada, Thailand, Vietnam, Ethiopia. So we have a good geographic and global mix of people, and a number of people have submitted questions, and I'll try to online, and I'll try to share some of those questions as we go along as well. We did put a poll online asking, in your experience, how difficult is it to acquire localized climate data? And 40% of the respondents said that localized climate data is available. 10% said that they have access to climate data, but it's not localized. 20% said they have climate data, but the quality is questionable. And 20% says, I know who has data, but I don't have access to it. And finally, 30% say, I don't know where to go for climate data in general. So I guess that leads to, there's one question for Matthias, but yeah, I'll from Chiara Trebaki online that says that the risk models provided by major vendors are not open source. How can people tweak parameters so that we can incorporate climate change stress test model outputs based on different climate change scenarios? I think I'm going to back that question up slightly, and you can maybe address that in particular question, but the question I have is really how do we, you guys have developed a lot of expertise at the IFC and Swiss Re and your like firms around assessing climate change risk and quantifying climate change risk. How do we get that to the masses? How do we get to decision makers, government, to other to financiers and investors and others, other key stakeholders in this in the infrastructure space?
So yes, I think we, the direct answer to your question is I think we need to bring it more to the masses, right? To make sure that the gap, which is which we call internally as we see the protection gap, which is so significant. Right? We need a high level of awareness in our societies about this gap so that we actually can reduce it. That's how we will make us more resilient. And typically in the commercial and industrial space, there is good insurance in place. What worries me personally, and I know it's also a worry at Swiss Re, it's that in the personal line space, which means your own property, that's really where the protection gap is the biggest, especially so in emerging markets. And just to highlight something we did recently as a company internally to address this is we had a meeting of a number of senior leaders of the company, and they had to come up with ways they could think of filling this protection gap. And initially during that meeting, somebody asked the question, well, are we looking here at the markets where it may generate business and therefore money for us? Or are we looking really at solving a problem for our societies? And, you know, we're a private company, but I was actually quite impressed that the answer from our CEO of reinsurance said, really what we want to hear is to focus on emerging markets and really providing a solution. So with regards to the models in modeling natural catastrophes, this comment is absolutely right. There is most of the market in the reinsurance industry is driven by actually one vendor model, and that's pretty opaque. So I think indeed it would be easier if models were a little more open, and perhaps that's an opportunity for the academic sector. I mean, there are lots of great scientists out there who could perhaps help there in modeling the financial consequences as well of catastrophes.
Vladimir, do you want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned it earlier, how IFC is sharing some of your collecting, and can you talk a little bit more about how you're sharing that your learnings with the broader community?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So as a public institution, IFC and World Bank Group in general, we try to put out all the information that we have. So the World Bank Climate Portal, which can be works, and especially the ones that I mentioned, we try to use publicly accessible models. So for example, for the Kafka Gorge Lower, the hydropower project, we use RedScreen, which is, again, a freely available model. We just use Excel, which is not freely available, but there are emulations of Excel so that everybody can replicate the same results and using the data that we provide and tweak it in the way they want it. Now, so that's on the existing data. I think a big question is the data or information that still doesn't exist. So there's a lot of information that's relevant, that is needed, but it's not out there because it's not produced. Just an example, we're working now on ports, and one of the key drivers is wind. And the GCM models produce wind information only as a daily average. I don't want to go into details, but that's not very useful if we are trying to assess the risk of closure and impacts on the port infrastructure. So the scientific community is working on that. I think that we as users need to be signaling to the scientific community what are the needs, and then once that is out there, share it among everybody.
Can I make a quick comment? This discussion was focused on localized climate information and preparation for impacts. I've experienced situations, particularly I'm thinking back to 2012, where there was a huge natural disaster in Japan, and I was working elsewhere in the globe where we had a lot of generators that were expected to provide power to very needy communities. The market, the international market for generators, just went. We couldn't access any of the equipment that we had on order. So you're talking about localized risk, and you're talking about what might happen in my community, but what happens across the globe might very well impact your ability to continue with plans you have, especially for relates to power.
Okay, we have a question from the audience here.
Hi, I'm Ashley King from USAID's Climate Change Office. I have 3 amazing presentations. I have a million questions for each of you. But I'll just pick one. Roseanne, I was curious, President Obama a few years ago signed an executive order on climate resilient development. How is Power Africa, so the executive order requires all U.S. agencies working internationally in international development to start factoring in climate change. How is Power Africa thinking about implementing that executive order and thinking about how their model may need to be tweaked, the Power Africa model may need to be tweaked to sort of fully mainstream climate risk across all the agencies that are working on Power Africa?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and I meant to weave that into my comments. So kind of from the beginning, Power Africa has approached our work with that lens of climate objectives exist, it's kind of that coexist bumper sticker of we exist for the purposes I described earlier, but with the understanding of what the climate goals are. And so I think everything I said before stands in the sense that we always have the executive order requirements in mind. We have worked with the Global Climate Change Office since the beginning to say, how do we make sure that our objectives correspond and that we are maximizing the opportunity to achieve our own objectives, but in correspondence with the others. So the all of the above approach that I described earlier is reality that most of the countries and economies we work in, you can't just pick specific power sources and call it a day. You have to have these balanced portfolios of power for the renewables to be incorporated as well as possible, but also looking at especially on the governance side, on the infrastructure side, work we're doing with utilities, work we're doing to help develop power pools so that what we're doing is helping to create that possibility for countries, and many of them are developing from very nascent power systems, from very, very undeveloped, as I said, 30% access rate. Some of them are just very much at this place where planning is so important about how do you maximize the opportunity of using climate-friendly or lower carbon opportunities. So I don't think I can give you anything more concrete than that, other than that is always on our radar. We work very closely with the Global Climate Change Office, and I think increasingly we're just trying to figure out the ways that, especially on the enabling environment side, we're solidifying host countries' capability of responding to their own goals on climate and on carbon emissions.
I have a somewhat related question for Vladimir from Michael Berger online that I wanted to run by you. It says, Michael asked, are the analyses being discussed here and undertaken by others on the line being performed in the context of environmental assessments or environmental impact review, or in a separate financial assessment or other analysis framework? And maybe you can speak a little bit to the climate risk assessment that and the approach that IFC is taking more broadly now in reaction to the climate change risks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So the studies that I showed were done as separate works, and that's mostly because these are pilot works. One of that were used to develop methodologies and approaches. By the way, all these studies and many more are available on our website. It's www.ifc.org/climate risks, one word, plural. And we have a couple of others in agribusiness and a few more. But back to the question, so it was one-off, but right now we're integrating this into our mainstream project appraisal. So basically the idea is that when we go to appraise projects for their financial, environmental, social viability, climate change is always an integral part of this assessment. And then whatever risk or opportunities is seen there, that it's managed again as part of the normal process.
Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Matt Tulisic. I work with Matt Austin in the private capital microenterprise office. My question is, what impact does the setting of these projects have? I noticed most of the projects you showed us were rural, not urban. So what impact would building these types of facilities in a more urban setting have on your assessment of the climate risk?
It's a question for me. Well, so the second one, and unfortunately I didn't have more time to spend on it. The port is really part of the city. So it was looked at as a part of the city because of all the connections with society that lives around, and part of it was how the changes in wind may be spreading coke ash towards the societies. So as a preventive measure, the adaptation solution, it's called, was just to be spraying much more and covering it. The other part was looking at the transport routes that go through town, how these may be affected and turn affect the company. So that was inside of town. The other one, the hydropower, obviously, just because of its size, was outside. The differences between the two, I think it's this interaction with wider community. While in the hydropower project we did look at indigenous communities, the set of questions and polls was very different from urban ones.
Eric, I'm in USAID Economic Policy Office and Senior Project Manager. 2 questions for Swiss Re. How often do you revise the climate change models that you use to reflect changes in science? And could you give us just an approximate cost on what the premiums would be for the 2 hydropower and the wind facilities that we are using in the examples?
Sure, those are both great questions. So, regarding the modeling, it's actually a tricky one because at the end of the day, most of our contracts are on a yearly basis. So right now, we're working on contracts that will expire in July 2017. So, there we update our models given the data we have right now and the things, the parameters that are relevant right now. So water temperature, anything, is it a El Niño year or La Niña year? These kind of things. So that's updated all the time. They're always up to date. But I would say for what's going to happen in the next year, the projections for 2050 are not that relevant, right? So we have a bit of a day-to-day approach to our modeling. This being said, our models need to be nimble to be constantly adapted for bigger findings, right? And what we do is we have these departments that work in parallel and look at the risk landscape in the future and what it will look like. And their climate change and assumptions around climate change are absolutely critical. And there we look at your 50-50. What is the world going to look like? What are the risks related to climate change that we're going to have? What are the right insurance solutions? So there these scientific developments are taken into account. But as you know, there are many scenarios you need to look at, and there's a lot of uncertainty for scenarios projecting 30 years in the future. But we look at all of them and try to make sure we're well positioned. Regarding the premium levels we're looking at for those examples of the wind farm that unfortunately could have no wind next year, or the hydro electric station that is fed by a lake with no water. So the typical premium you would pay is roughly around $300,000 to $500,000 per year for that size of project. Now, if it's a larger project, it's going to cost more. If it's a smaller, it's going to cost less. And actually, there's quite a bit of variation. If we talk about a nuclear power plant, which is a completely different thing, right? Yeah. But those are monsters, and insurance premiums are easily in the $30 million to cover just the construction of a nuclear power plant, for example.
There's a question from Kevin Coffey online related to premiums as well, and whether you anticipate these premiums going up significantly over time, and are you looking ahead at premium levels 10, 15 years down in the future, and as you engage with your clients and as they're designing and developing their projects, is there a discussion around what this could look like 10 years from now, and whether an insurance product might even be might not even be available for a project 10 years from now, given the scenarios that you're running in your models and whatnot.
Thanks, Matt. That's a great question. And Vladimir and I were actually just talking about this yesterday evening. And so if we look at the future, the ideal situation is the following: that all the small losses you have, the events that are relatively frequent, that those are actually handled mostly through loss prevention, as in Vladimir's example. So the little things, because those are actually costly. If you have little things happening at a high frequency, that's going to come at a high cost. And the insurance companies will always need to have a margin on top. Their distribution costs, they need to be able to operate as well. So it's best if we cover as much of those high frequency, smaller losses through loss prevention. What the insurance industry is really here for, and where it really does add value to our societies, is to cover the very big and very rare events. This earthquake we had in California in 1906, where half of the city burned down. That's what the industry, the insurance industry is here for. And because these events are rare, actually the cost of insurance is relatively low for this. Think of it as perhaps your umbrella insurance. Hopefully most of the audience has one. But if you have a million policy, for example, for your umbrella insurance, this costs $1 or $2, I think about $1 a day. Right? So that's really what you want to cover, is when things are going really bad. And I think for these things, because the events are rare, the cost of insurance is relatively low and should remain relatively low.
I
I
had a question for Vladimir, but also maybe for Matthias as well. And I think that both of you in your presentations, which I found both very interesting, highlighted kind of cases where there are gaps. So it seems like there's an opportunity, Vladimir, that you highlighted for doing this kind of analysis that could reveal to clients or to organizations that control infrastructure their risk, and might encourage them to actually take adaptive actions to protect that, which might have external effects in terms of creating a public good for a community or country or city. And Matthias, you mentioned the lack of cover in many emerging markets and developing countries. And I'm wondering if each of you could just comment on what kinds of interventions development organizations might make that would help to fill in those gaps and basically close those gaps or create more adaptive action.
So on the gaps, I was struck by the conversation where Razan mentioned the enabling environment, and Matthias was showing the importance of weather stations in being able to make the product, right? Because as I understand, without the weather stations around the hydropower project or by the wind project, you wouldn't be able to measure, right, how much there's rainfall, and therefore the product wouldn't exist. And what we are finding in developing countries is that this lack of weather station is crucial, and Alan has been involved quite a lot with that and knows. Without weather station, insurance companies says, look, we have no certainty about how to measure this. We could structure a product, it's going to cost really a lot of money to account for uncertainty. So these are, I think, the important gaps that and it's part of the creating of enabling environment that are necessary. To the first part of the question, I think it's a great point. One of the things is that we're seeing is that many companies are doing this internally, the analysis of climate change impacts, because there is more and more understanding that this is a competitive thing. So if I may lose due to climate change, and all of the sector loses, and then if I do something to adapt, I'm better than the others. I'm much more competitive. So this notion of competitiveness is I think it's appearing to many companies, and they're doing this analysis internally, although they may not be propagating it externally and saying, well, this is what we have done. I think we can see also in the market that there are more and more companies offering services for adaptation, or services of information that can serve for adaptation, serving these big companies. So I think that the market is on the move.
Yeah, I would comment that we really need the help from governments in many places to have more attention on this protection gap. I mean, one example that just comes to mind is in Colombia, and you may have seen this in the news towards the end of 2013, a huge high-rise collapsed. And this is not a unique example. It also happened once in Rio, where they used some sand from the beach, right, Ipanema, to build, to mix that into the concrete, and the whole thing collapsed, right? So after that, there was a sense of urgency. We need to have insurance in place for those situations, and this so-called inherent defect insurance that is, for example, compulsory in France and in Spain as well. But what then often happens is this sense of urgency survives as long as it's in the news and for about 6 months, and then perhaps you have a government change and it gets forgotten again. So I think it will help if, and certainly part of the burden here is on the insurance industry to make sure that that sense of urgency remains, because at the end of the day, I think insurance being in place will help those societies.
We'll take one last question, and then we're about out of time. Alan, do you?
Yeah, I thought we hadn't heard enough from Roseanne, so on a slightly different
I was happy to talk.
take on this. In Africa, a lot of investment is coming from China now, and I would think that issues of international cooperation. You mentioned how many different agencies just within the U.S. are involved with Power Africa, but are you finding some shared cooperation, including, for example, with China, that begins to recognize the importance of these issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the partnership approach for Power Africa, I focused on the U.S. government, but really it's partnership writ large, and Power Africa has explicit MOUs with many other governments, with the World Bank, with DFID, with other development agencies. And so we're really trying to make sure that our approach to working with host governments in Africa is, it's never going to be perfectly aligned, but that to the degree that we can, that we coordinate and make sure that investments are pushing in the same direction or mutually reinforcing. On the side of China, I think it's just a reality that there is a lot of investment in sub-Saharan Africa by China. And I know that USAID has specifically looked at how do we approach that in the most productive way possible. I think the area where we differ the most potentially is on well, there's a number of ways, but potentially on kind of the environmental and social safeguards, which again brings in this whole concept of risk. Anything climate related is quite tied closely to social safeguards and to just basic environmental risks for those communities. So that's one area, and the other is the integration of local resources, local human resources particularly, but materials and the investments that go into projects. So I'd say the dialogue is definitely a bit more prevalent than it was before. We're looking at what's the best potential way that we complement what's the investments that are being made by China. Again, it's usually a dialogue with those host governments. The host governments are the ones that are engaging all of the international donors or all of the investors in the private sector. And so looking at how do we talk in partnership with the host governments about how to maximize those investments and make sure that they're complementary and make sure that basic standards are being met so that you're not getting these sand infused large buildings that are going to, because when one thing collapses, the other things collapse. power is a sector, and any failure in that link, in that chain, is going to have an effect on the rest of it. And so that's just reality, and I think there's a lot of creative thought about how do we make sure that we're maximizing the investments that are being made.
Great, thanks. Just a couple of concluding thoughts here, and then we'll wrap up. I mean, to me, I think we're kind of in uncharted territory here when it comes to climate change, and I mean, there's a lot of really smart thinking of people thinking about what the potential impacts are going to be from climate change, and I think there's going to be a need for flexibility and adaptation, as Matthias talked about, in terms of how Swiss Re is modeling these things and thinking about it. There's still a lot of data gaps out there, and our modeling is going to need to continue to evolve going forward based on our experiences as we go into these uncharted waters. And second, I think that there's a role for development agencies and MDBs like the World Bank Group in working with our partner countries to ensure that the decision makers and then infrastructure on the infrastructure planning side are really thinking about these issues and incorporating climate change risk into all the analyses that are being done around infrastructure development in developing markets. And I think there's also a role for us to really facilitate the sharing of knowledge and learning and helping to address some of the gaps in capacity and data and information in the markets we're operating in. So I think it's been a great, a lot of insight shared here. I've learned a lot moderating. I appreciate everybody joining us here in person and online. For those online, there were a number of questions that we didn't get to, and we'll try our best to get the questions that were directed at particular speakers to them, and hopefully get some responses back to you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.